Hello and welcome back to another demo about the REFramework template. In this demo, we're continuing to build our UI demo process by changing the transaction item type to DataRow and updating the activities impacted by the change. In the previous video, we've edited the project's config file with all of the necessary data applicable to our process. You may remember that we've also added our Excel file and the pre-built workflow files to the project folders. If you're building along and you haven't done so already, this is a good time to copy the workflow files to the project folder. Copy the Excel file to the data folder and open the REFramework without QueueItems checklist. In this demo, we'll modify the transaction item variable and argument type to DataRow and explain the steps to resolve validation errors within the getTransactionData and processTransaction states. All set? Great! Let's continue working on the project. Let's start by opening the main workflow. Our goal is to change the configuration that, by default, gets the transaction item from an orchestrator queue. As seen in the Variables panel, currently the transaction item variable is of type QueueItem. However, in our example, we'll use the input data in the Excel file to read to a data table. Instead of processing QueueItems, the automation will process data rows. Each row of the spreadsheet contains data about a single transaction. The first transaction uses the data on the first Excel row. The second transaction uses the data on the second row, and so on. Let's go ahead and change the type from QueueItem to DataRow. That is system.data.DataRow. Note how this change generates validation errors in two states: getTransactionData and processTransaction. This tells us that we need to configure a few activities as well. Let's check the getTransactionData state first. We have a validation error for the end process assign from the then block of the if activity. Remember, when we receive a stop signal, we assign the value nothing to the transaction item, which triggers the transition to the end process state. This validation error may be a bit counterintuitive. It happens because previously the transaction item was of QueueItem type, and the assign stores information of the type argument. Since we've changed the type to DataRow, even though the value nothing can apply to both types, the transaction item variable is no longer compatible with the QueueItem type argument defined in the assign activity. We just need to force a refresh for this activity. If we remove the value, save it and retype nothing, then the validation error disappears. Next, we'll continue with the invoke getTransactionData workflow activity where the outTransactionItem argument is of type QueueItem. Of course, we need to change it to DataRow as well. And we still have a validation error. By clicking exception within the try-catch activity, we notice another assign activity for ending the process. We'll make a similar change here as done in the previous assign activity. Remove one of the values and add it back to force a refresh. And the validation error is now cleared. Perfect! We've now completed updating the getTransactionData state. An important note before moving forward is that a transaction item can be any type of element inside a collection. In other words, these steps can be applied for other types of transactions, such as emails of mail message type and paths to files as string type. Next, let's go back to the main workflow and open the processTransaction state. Here, we can notice that the invoke process workflow activity also has a validation error. Let's take a look at the imported arguments. Once again, we must change the type for the inTransactionItem argument from QueueItem to DataRow. Within the processTransaction state, the setTransactionStatus workflow is invoked 3 times: when the transaction is successful, when a business exception occurs, and when a system or application exception occurs. So, we need to change the in_transaction_item value in all 3 places. First, let's begin with a successful case. As we know, for successful cases, set transaction status.xaml enclosed in a try-catch activity is invoked following the framework/process.xaml within the same try block. So, let's click on the Import Arguments button of the Invoke Set Transaction Status Success activity. If we look at the imported arguments, we could change the type for the InTransactionItem argument to DataRow. However, we already have logic in the invoked workflow to verify the transaction item is not nothing, and to check if it is a QueueItem or not. Only if these two conditions are met will it set the QueueItem status in Orchestrator. Since this check is in place, it's easier for us to just remove the value or set it to nothing. This will disable the status reporting in the Orchestrator queue. So, let's set the in_transaction_item value to nothing. Of course, if needed for reporting purposes, we can switch the in_transaction_item argument type to DataRow. Next, in case of a business exception, set transaction status.xaml enclosed in a try-catch activity is invoked in the business rule exception catch block. Let's set the in_transaction_item value to nothing by clicking the Import Arguments button of the Invoke Set Transaction Status Business Rule Exception activity. In case of a system exception, set transaction status.xaml enclosed in a try-catch activity is invoked in the system exception catch block. Let's set in_transaction_item value to nothing by clicking the Import Arguments button of the Invoke Set Transaction Status System Exception activity. A few more changes must be implemented in the Set Transaction Status workflow itself, but we'll see these in a different demo. Now let's save our work. Excellent, the main workflow is now free from validation errors. With this, we conclude our demo. In this video, we learned how to change the data type for the transaction item variable from QueueItem to DataRow, because our data comes from an Excel file, not an Orchestrator queue. For a quick review of our changes, what were the two states and their corresponding workflows that generated validation errors and needed configuration? What were the steps that we needed to check for the Change the Transaction Item Data Type section in our REFramework without QueueItems checklist? Have we skipped or missed any? Thank you for watching and see you soon.